At my grandson's wedding in the rolling hills of Tuscany, I raised a glass of champagne that could have been my last. I'm Robert Langford, 68 years old, and until recently, I was the man who built Langford Transport from nothing more than a single truck and a stubborn belief that hard work could carve out a legacy. When I sold the company for more money than I ever imagined, enough to secure 3 generations, my plan was simple: celebrate my family, honor the memory of my late wife Margaret, and finally allow myself to breathe. That's why I paid for this wedding, a destination in Italy, a dream for my grandson and his young bride. It was meant to be joy. Instead, it nearly became my funeral. The villa overlooked vineyards that seemed to stretch into forever, bathed in the golden light of an Italian sunset. Guests moved between long wooden tables draped in white linen, their laughter rising into the warm evening air. Music drifted from a quartet near the fountain, the sound soft and romantic, perfectly suited for such a night. I should have been at peace, surrounded by family, yet across the table my son and his wife watched me with smiles that felt more rehearsed than sincere. "Father," my son said, lifting his glass, "to you, to the empire you built, and to the fortune that will carry us all forward." His words dripped with charm, but beneath them I heard something else, something sharp, metallic, and cold. His wife leaned in, placing a manicured hand on my arm, her eyes glinting in the candlelight. "You've done enough, Robert. Now it's our turn to take care of you." Her touch was light, but it chilled me. I smiled politely, masking the unease that coiled in my chest. I told myself it was my imagination, that after decades of sacrifice I was simply too tired to trust. But then it happened. A waiter approached, moving with careful precision through the crowded tables. He was young, dark-haired, and though his face was composed, his eyes flickered with urgency. He leaned close to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Signore, non beva. Qualcuno ha messo qualcosa nel suo bicchiere." I froze. The words struck like ice water poured down my spine. "Signor, non beva. Alguien colocó algo en sua taza." My hand tightened around the stem of the glass, the bubble still rising innocently within it. From a distance it was a scene of celebration. Guests laughing, cameras flashing, the bride and groom glowing with joy. But at my seat, time had stopped. I didn't flinch, I didn't gasp. Years of closing impossible deals had taught me to control every flicker of expression. I looked at the waiter and gave a slow, imperceptible nod. He stepped back, vanishing into the sea of guests, leaving me alone with the weight of his warning. My son returned his gaze to me, his smile wide, his glass raised high. Around us, the call came for a toast. Dozens of arms lifted, the crystal catching fire in the candlelight. I hesitated only for a second, then gently tilted my glass forward without letting it touch my lips. The champagne shimmered as if mocking me, promising life, even as it carried death. I placed the glass down softly, as though distracted by the speeches. With the motion of an old man fumbling, I let it tip, spilling across the linen. Gasps and laughter rose from nearby guests, thinking it was nothing but clumsiness, but as the golden liquid spread, I pressed the corner of my napkin into the spill, folding it quickly and tucking it into my jacket pocket. The laughter around me swelled again. The bride clinked her glasses, and my family clinked theirs. But inside, my heart thundered with the knowledge that someone at that very table, my own blood, wanted me dead. I looked at my son and his wife, both radiant in the glow of the reception lights, and for the first time I wondered whether everything I had built had been nothing more than fuel for their greed. I smiled back at them, steady, calm, the perfect mask, yet in my pocket I carried the damp weight of a truth that would not let me sleep. The wedding ended in fireworks and applause, but I carried something far heavier back across the ocean. A folded napkin, damp and stained, pressed deep into the pocket of my suit. That small square of cloth was more valuable than gold. It was the only proof that my life had nearly been stolen in the middle of a family celebration. On the flight home, I sat in first class while other passengers slept, the steady hum of the engines masking the storm inside my chest. My son and his wife had toasted me with smiles too wide, voices too sweet. I replayed every detail, each gesture, each glance. If not for that waiter, God bless his courage, I might have been lying cold in a foreign morgue instead of staring into the black Atlantic sky. When we landed, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of sitting in that empty house, surrounded by Margaret's photographs and her favorite paintings, knowing our son had plotted this, no, I wouldn't let her memory watch me break. Instead, I told the driver to take me downtown to a discreet medical building I knew well. Langford Transport had used its lab for employee drug screenings. They were fast, thorough, and most importantly, silent. The lobby smelled of antiseptic, as cold and sterile as my resolve. A young technician in a white coat stood behind a glass partition, his expression blank with routine. I reached into my coat and pulled out a small plastic bag I had taken from the plane. Inside it, the folded napkin, still damp. I slid it through the drawer, my voice even though my pulse hammered like a drum. "I need a full toxicology analysis," I said. "Organic, inorganic, everything, tonight." The technician blinked, surprised. "Sir, priority analysis is costly. Money is not an issue." My tone left no room for argument. He nodded, swiped my card, and slid a form toward me. I scribbled my private email on the line, pushed it back, and turned away before doubt could creep into my voice. I couldn't sit in the sterile waiting room, not with its magazines and humming lights, so I walked into the night, found a small diner that smelled of burnt coffee and old secrets. I slid into a booth and ordered black coffee I didn't intend to drink. Through the window, neon signs buzzed and strangers hurried past. My hands rested on the table, now empty without the napkin, but still trembling as if holding its weight. The question clawed at me. Should I call the police? File a report? Tell the world my own son had tried to kill me? The image of newspaper headlines flashed before me. Businessman poisoned by son at wedding. My company's name, my late wife's name dragged through the mud. My grandson's marriage forever shadowed by scandal. No, I couldn't allow that. This wasn't a matter for the courts. It was something darker. Something that demanded a surgeon's precision, not a policeman's handcuffs. 3 hours later, my phone buzzed against the tabletop. The message came encrypted, the subject line a sterile string of numbers. My breath caught as I opened it. Lines of chemical jargon filled the screen, but at the top, a plain summary. Substance detected. Lethal concentration. Ingestion would cause cardiac arrest within 1 to 2 hours. Symptoms consistent with natural heart failure. The words blurred for a moment, as if the screen itself recoiled from their weight. There it was, the confirmation, clinical and undeniable. Someone hadn't just wanted me gone. They wanted me erased, as if I had collapsed naturally under the strain of age and wealth. I closed my eyes, the hum of the diner fading to silence. Margaret's voice came back to me, soft and steady. "Be careful, Robert. He sees you as a bank, not a father." I had dismissed her fears once. Now they echoed like prophecy. I slipped the phone into my pocket, stood, and walked into the night. My steps were slow, deliberate, each one carrying me closer to a truth I could no longer avoid. My son had tried to kill me, and I would not let him succeed. I didn't sleep that night. The report from the lab glowed in my mind long after I closed the file. each word etched into my memory like a verdict. Lethal. Cardiac arrest. Natural causes. It was the perfect disguise, and it had almost worked. By dawn, I was standing at the window of my study, watching the city wake beneath a sky the color of ash. My house was quiet, too quiet. The photographs of Margaret on the mantel seemed to watch me, her smile frozen in time. She would have told me to fight, but not with rage, with clarity. That was the woman she was, calm in a storm, steady when I faltered. So I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years, Cynthia Walsh. She had been my legal counsel for decades, sharp as steel and twice as unyielding. But this wasn't just legal work. This required shadows. When she answered, her voice was firm, awake even at that early hour. "Robert, what happened?" I told her enough to silence any pleasantries. The toast, the waiter, the napkin, the lab. She listened without interruption, only the scratch of her pen marking the gravity of my words. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "You need more than me," she said. "You need eyes where they think no one is looking." 2 hours later, I was sitting in a private office downtown, across from two men and a woman whose resumes read like a dossier of shadows, former FBI, ex-IRS, and one investigator who had once traced cartel money through 6 countries. They didn't waste time asking why. They asked only for names, addresses, and access. "Find everything," I told them, "not just money. Friends, debts, secrets. I want to know the ground they stand on and how close it is to giving way." They nodded, already moving. I left the office lighter, though the weight on my chest hadn't eased. For the first time since that night in Tuscany, I felt the faint spark of control. The first report arrived 3 days later, encrypted and cold. I opened it in the dim light of my study, Margaret's portrait hanging above me like silent witness. What I read tightened my jaw until it ached. Kevin and his wife, it turned out, had been living in a world built on illusions. Months before the wedding, they had poured borrowed money into ventures overseas. A small vineyard outside Florence, pitched as a family legacy project. A restaurant in Barcelona, designed to look like a chic hotspot for tourists. On paper, it was glamorous. In reality, both businesses were crumbling, drowning in unpaid bills and late wages. The vineyard hadn't sold a bottle in 6 months. The restaurant had closed its doors twice due to renovations, but the truth was simpler. They couldn't afford to keep the lights on. Creditors circled like vultures, and private lenders were demanding repayment with interest rates that bordered on criminal. The total debt, over $1 million. I leaned back, the report heavy in my hand. Suddenly, their desperation came into sharp focus. This wasn't about impatience, about wanting the inheritance sooner. It was survival. They had gambled recklessly, using my name as collateral, and now the walls were closing in. I could almost hear Kevin's voice from the wedding. "Now it's our turn to take care of you." The words had been a mask, hiding not generosity, but hunger. They didn't want to take care of me. They wanted me gone, so the fortune I had earned could bail them out of the pit they had dug with their own greed. I placed the report on the desk, staring at Margaret's portrait. Her eyes, painted in soft tones, seemed to ask the question I was already asking myself. How had I been so blind? The answer didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. The investigators promised more in the days to follow, but even this first glimpse was enough. Kevin and his wife had built their empire on sand, and they believed I was the tide that would wash their sins clean. They were wrong. The next update from the investigators arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The storm outside mirrored the heaviness that settled over me as I opened the encrypted file. I expected more numbers, more debts, maybe another failed business. What I found instead was worse. Far worse. It began with photographs, high-resolution images taken discreetly in the back rooms of jewelry shops across New York and Milan. I recognized the pieces instantly. The sapphire brooch Margaret had worn on our 25th anniversary. The pearl necklace she had inherited from her mother. The diamond ring I had given her on the day we closed on our first house. Each piece carried a memory, and seeing them on a jeweler's velvet cloth instead of in the velvet-lined box in my safe made my stomach twist. My daughter-in-law, Brenda, had been shopping them around as if they were trinkets to be bartered. The report detailed how she had approached multiple dealers under the guise of family estate planning. She claimed her father-in-law's health was failing, that I wanted things quietly liquidated before the end. Some had refused, uncomfortable with the lack of paperwork. Others had humored her long enough for my investigators to document every attempt. I set the file down and walked into the study where Margaret's jewelry box still sat on the dresser. I opened it slowly, half hoping the report was wrong, but the pieces were gone. Only empty slots remained where they had once rested, each void a wound. I closed the lid, my hands trembling. The betrayal cut deeper than money, deeper than debts. These weren't just jewels. They were the story of our lives, our triumphs, our struggles, our promises. Margaret had worn them with pride, each one a chapter of the life we built together. And now her memory was being pawned off in secret by the woman who had married my son. The rage that rose in me was not loud, it was cold, precise. This wasn't greed anymore. This was desecration. My son might have been desperate enough to see me as an obstacle, but his wife had crossed into something even darker, erasing Margaret piece by piece from our family story. I sat down at my desk and read further. The investigators had managed to intercept a conversation between Brenda and a dealer in Milan. She had sent photographs from inside my own home, taken during visits when she pretended to check up on me. I could see her now, smiling sweetly, asking if I wanted more tea, while her phone's camera clicked in the next room. The gall of it made my skin crawl. She hadn't just taken inventory, she had spoken of me in the past tense. "My father-in-law is very ill. He won't be needing these much longer," she had said. I closed my eyes, and for a moment Margaret's face appeared before me. Her laughter, the way her hand felt in mine when she slipped on that sapphire brooch, joking that it made her look too royal for a truck driver's wife. If she could see this now, her heart would break. I whispered into the quiet room, more to her memory than to myself. "They're not just stealing from me, Margaret. They're stealing from you." The fury crystallized into resolve. It wasn't enough to protect myself anymore. I had to protect her memory too. The report ended with a stark note. The jewels hadn't yet been sold. They were still moving from shop to shop, still being offered to the highest bidder. That meant there was time. Time to act. Time to make sure Margaret's legacy wasn't reduced to price tags and whispered lies in the back rooms of jewelers. As I closed the file, I realized something had shifted inside me. The attempted poisoning had been a crime against my body, but this was a crime against my soul, and I would not forgive it. The investigators didn't take long to deliver their next blow. It came in the form of a scanned document, neatly formatted, stamped, and filed with the precision of any legitimate record. At first glance, it looked ordinary, an authorization form for access to several of my newly created accounts following the sale of Langford Transport. My name appeared at the bottom, bold and confident, the kind of signature I had placed on thousands of contracts over the years. But it wasn't mine. I leaned closer, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. To anyone else, it would have passed unnoticed. The loops, the slant, the flourish, it was masterful. Whoever had forged it knew my hand well, perhaps too well. But I knew the truth. I never signed such a document. The report explained it in brutal detail. 3 months earlier, my son, Kevin, had submitted this falsified authorization to the bank. It granted him secondary access to certain accounts that held the bulk of the proceeds from the company's sale. The deception was carefully layered. He wasn't asking for daily control, just emergency authority in case my health declined. Health declined. I could almost hear Brenda's voice whispering that phrase to a bank manager, her eyes brimming with practiced concern. It was the same performance she had given in those jewelry shops, speaking of me as though I were already gone. The investigators had even obtained security footage from the bank lobby. Kevin, in a tailored suit, smiling as he handed over the papers. The manager shook his hand. To them, he looked every bit the dutiful son, ensuring his aging father's finances were secure. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. My own blood had signed me out of my life, turning me into a figurehead while he prepared to strip everything I had built. He hadn't come to this plan in desperation last week or last month. No, he had laid the groundwork long before the wedding in Tuscany, planting the seeds of control months in advance. The timing was deliberate. He knew about my last physical, the routine checkups. He knew the doctors had warned me to take it easy. It was the perfect backdrop for his story. An aging father, successful but frail, preparing for the inevitable. Who would question him when he said he was only stepping in to help? I pushed back from the desk, my chair scraping the hardwood floor. Margaret's portrait stared down at me, her painted eyes filled with the steadiness I no longer felt. I whispered into the silence, "He planned this, Margaret. He's been planning it all along." The realization settled like lead in my chest. This wasn't a moment of madness, not an act of panic. It was strategy. Kevin had studied me like a blueprint, knowing my habits, my health, even the rhythm of my signature. He had prepared the papers months before the first drop of poison touched my glass. The report closed with a chilling line. Had this forgery gone undiscovered, Kevin Langford would have had full authority to transfer funds in the event of Robert Langford's incapacitation or death. Incapacitation or death. The words echoed with the coldness of a verdict. I closed the file and pressed my palms into the desk. For the first time in my life, I felt not just betrayed, but replaced. My son had forged my name, stolen my voice, and prepared a world where I no longer existed. But I was still here, breathing, watching, waiting. And if Kevin thought he had signed away my life, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. For days after the discovery of the forged document, I walked through my house like a ghost. Not because I was broken, but because I wanted Kevin and Brenda to believe I was. Every phone call, every visit, every carefully measured sigh was part of the role I had chosen. The aging father, tired and fragile, drifting toward the end. When Kevin called the next morning, his tone was coated in syrup. "Dad, how are you feeling today? Any, lingering effects from the trip?" I let a pause stretch, just long enough for him to think I was gathering strength. "A bit tired, son. The doctors say I need to slow down. Maybe it's time I stop worrying about business and start putting things in order." There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint exhale he tried to disguise as sympathy. "That's probably wise," he said. "You've carried the burden long enough. Let us handle things now." Let us handle things. The same words Brenda had used in Tuscany, now repeated like a chorus. I forced a weak chuckle, the sound hollow. "Yes, perhaps you're right." What he didn't know was that my every word was scripted, rehearsed in the quiet of my study until it sounded just frail enough to convince. The visits followed quickly. Brenda arrived first, carrying soup in a porcelain container, her smile luminous, but her eyes restless. She fluffed the cushions on my chair, asked if I was sleeping,
leaned in with concern so perfectly staged it could have earned applause. While she pretended to tidy the living room, her gaze slid to Margaret's paintings on the wall, lingering too long. I noticed the subtle tilt of her phone, the faint click of a camera hidden behind her screen. "Beautiful pieces," she murmured. "You should let me catalog them, for safekeeping." I nodded as though grateful, even as I memorized the angle of her shot. She thought I was blind. In truth, I was watching every move with an intensity sharpened by betrayal. Kevin came later that week, dressed too well for a casual visit. He paced my study, asking careful questions. "Dad, have you spoken to Cynthia recently about estate planning?" I rubbed my chest, faking the stiffness of age. Yes, we've discussed some options. A trust, perhaps. Something for the family." His eyes lit up, though he tried to hide it. He leaned forward, voice soft. "That's wise. We'll make sure your legacy is protected." Protected. He thought he was winning. That was the point. Behind the scenes, Cynthia and the investigators worked tirelessly. More deaths surfaced, more failed ventures, more proof that their world was held together with lies and desperation. Each discovery was another weapon we would use. But timing was everything. To strike too soon would ruin the performance. So I let the charade continue. I answered their calls with a frail voice, spoke of doctors and fatigue, dropped hints about paperwork and legacy. Each word was bait, each sigh a lure. But in the quiet hours of the night when the house was dark and the mask could slip, I sat at my desk with the report spread before me. I studied every page, every signature, every whisper of their treachery. Not with anger now, but with precision. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt her presence not as sorrow, but as strength. She had always known Kevin's hunger would devour him. She had warned me. Now, at last, I was listening. The role I played for my son was that of a weak old man too tired to resist. But the truth was far different. I was not fading. I was sharpening. Every call, every visit, every photograph they stole was another brick in the wall of their undoing. They thought they were circling a dying man. In reality, they were walking straight into a trap.
The day of the meeting arrived under a sky the color of steel. From the window of Cynthia's 40th floor office, I watched the city below. Ants of traffic, strangers hurrying, none of them aware that high above their heads, lives were about to be unmade. The conference room was a place designed for power. The table stretched long and dark, its polished surface reflecting the gray light of morning. 12 leather chairs surrounded it, but only 4 would be filled today. On the table in front of Cynthia sat a neat stack of folders, blue, thick, aligned with surgical precision. To anyone else, they might have looked like ordinary legal paperwork. To me, they were a blade. We didn't speak much as we prepared. There was no need. Weeks of planning had led to this. Cynthia glanced at me once, her eyes steady, and gave the smallest nod. Everything was ready. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy door opened. Kevin entered first, carrying himself with the swagger of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. He wore a new suit, tailored to perfection, his cologne sharp enough to sting. Brenda followed, radiant in a crimson dress, her smile stretched wide with triumph. "Dad!" Kevin boomed, crossing the room and pulling me into an embrace. It was the first time he had hugged me in years. His touch felt foreign, unwelcome, the embrace of a man who thought he had already won. Brenda kissed my cheek, her voice a melody of false warmth. "Robert, you look so well. We told you all you needed was rest." But her eyes flicked to the stack of folders on the table, hungry, darting, already counting bills that hadn't yet been promised. They sat across from us, side by side, hands intertwined like actors in a play. Kevin leaned back in his chair, exuding casual authority, as though the table, the city, and the fortune were already his. "So," he said, rubbing his hands together, "the big day, the signing of the Langford Family Trust." He glanced at Brenda with a grin. "It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" She nodded, her voice soft and reverent. "It sounds like a legacy." I watched them as a scientist might watch insects under glass, detached, precise. Every flicker of their eyes, every tremor of their smiles told me more than words ever could. They believed they were moments away from victory. They didn't realize they were already trapped. Cynthia began the meeting in her usual crisp tone. "Before we proceed with any signing, there are preliminary items to address." The words seemed to land oddly in the room. Kevin's smile faltered, just for a second. Brenda shifted in her seat. The atmosphere, once buoyant with their anticipation, began to curdle with unease. Cynthia reached for the first folder. The sound of the cover opening was loud in the silence, like the crack of a judge's gavel. She slid a document across the table, her voice steady. Item 1. A certified laboratory report conducted on a sample taken from Mr. Langford's glass at the wedding in Tuscany. The analysis indicates a lethal concentration of a substance consistent with inducing cardiac arrest, virtually indistinguishable from natural heart failure. Kevin's eyes darted to the paper. His face stiffened. Brenda stared at him, confusion blooming into dread. Cynthia didn't pause. She opened the next folder, sliding it forward. Item 2. A consolidated summary of your finances. It details 2 delinquent mortgages, multiple repossession notices, and over $2 million in unsecured debt. Brenda's face lost its color. Her hand slipped from Kevin's, recoiling as though burned. Cynthia continued, her tone clinical. Item 3. Transcripts of calls placed by Mrs. Langford to jewelry dealers in New York and Milan, offering pieces belonging to the late Mrs. Margaret Langford under the claim that her father-in-law was nearing death. Kevin's head snapped toward Brenda, his jaw tight with accusation. She shook her head rapidly, whispering, I was just... But the words withered in the sterile air. And then Cynthia opened the last folder. Her voice dropped lower, colder. Item 4. A forged authorization form filed with the bank 3 months ago, granting Kevin Langford secondary access to his father's estate. Alongside it, digital records of searches conducted from burner devices regarding heart attack-inducing substances and how to conceal them in autopsies. The silence that followed was total. The city's hum outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall, even our breathing, it all seemed to vanish. Kevin sat motionless, his confidence shattered, his skin pale as paper. Brenda's lips trembled, but no sound came out. I leaned forward, my hands folded calmly on the table. My voice was quiet, steady, but it filled the room with finality. There will be no family trust. The words struck like a hammer. Their faces fell, their smiles gone, their victory dissolved. What remained was fear. The silence in that conference room was heavier than stone. Kevin stared at the papers in front of him, his hands limp, the swagger gone. Brenda looked as though the floor had given way beneath her. They had arrived expecting wealth, applause, and control. Instead, they faced the sum of their own betrayals, laid bare with surgical precision. Cynthia sat like a sentinel beside me, her voice crisp. merciless. You have two choices. She slid one last folder across the table, this one thicker than the rest. A single pen lay neatly on top. Choice 1, she said. We call the district attorney within the hour. Attempted murder, fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. You will both spend decades in prison. Brenda let out a gasp, half sob, half protest. Kevin's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Choice 2, Cynthia continued. You sign this agreement. By doing so, you surrender any future claim to your father's estate. You will forfeit the house, the cars, every asset tied to his name. In return, he will not press charges, and the evidence will remain sealed. You walk out of here, free, but with nothing. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on Kevin. You'll leave with only the clothes on your backs. No calls, no contact, no second chances. You disappear from my life as if you never existed. Brenda shook her head, tears spilling. Robert, please, this isn't fair. We were desperate. Desperate? My voice cut through hers, low but sharp. Desperation doesn't excuse selling Margaret's jewelry behind my back. It doesn't excuse forging my signature or pouring poison into my glass. That isn't desperation, that's desecration. Kevin's face twitched, a flicker of the boy I once knew buried under the weight of arrogance and greed. For a fleeting second, I wondered if he would deny it, shout, rage. But he didn't. His hand reached slowly toward the pen. It trembled as he picked it up. Without reading a word, he scrawled his name across the page, no longer the confident signature of a rising heir, but the broken script of a man undone. He slid the paper to Brenda. She hesitated, looking at him, searching for some kind of salvation, but there was none. With a sob, she signed her name too. Cynthia gathered the papers, stacked them with quiet finality, and closed the folder. It's done. They rose, slow and robotic. Neither looked at me, neither dared. The door closed behind them with a heavy click, and just like that, they were gone, taking with them years of illusion, the son I thought I had, the family I believed could be saved. For a long moment, I sat in silence. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. What I felt was sorrow, vast and quiet, like standing in a cathedral after the candles have burned out. 3 months have passed since that day. The seasons have shifted, the air grown cooler. I no longer live in the shadow of betrayal, but in the light of something new. Tonight, I stand in a small gallery downtown. The air smells of paint and possibility. The walls are lined with canvases by young artists, their dreams alive in every brushstroke. This exhibition, the first funded by the Margaret Langford Foundation, is crowded with faces I don't know, voices full of gratitude and hope. One young woman approaches me, her hand stained with color. She explains her work, a canvas of wild blues and fierce reds, chaos and beauty colliding. It reminds me of Margaret, the fire in her laugh, the resilience in her eyes. For the first time in years, I smile. Not the hollow smile of a man pretending to be weak, but the genuine smile of someone who has turned poison into purpose. I used to believe legacy was a fortune passed from father to son. Now I know better. Legacy is not what you leave to your family. It's what you leave in the world. My son chose greed. I chose Margaret's memory. And in that choice, I finally found peace.